Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. Welcome to being out at a restaurant again, Indigo, near Capitol Hill. Very happy to be here. We thank them for their hospitality. Bringing back to the show someone who's been on it before, Seth Moulton, Democrat from Massachusetts, member of the House of Representatives. Seth, it's good to see you.
Great to see you.
You have injected yourself into the post-election debate about what Democrats should or shouldn't do and what lessons it as a party should or should not take from the 2024 election. And part of that has been about a conversation about transgender rights, men playing girls' sports, your two daughters. I will use that as a springboard. Carry forth as you wish.
Sure. The fundamental issue is that we have a challenge as a party of even engaging in debate about contentious issues. And when we don't debate issues, when we refuse to acknowledge problems that Americans care about, then we just cede ground to the Republicans and we lose. So I use this example as one of many. It was a New York Times interview. I brought up a bunch. They seized on this one about how, there are a lot of Americans concerned about having their daughters injured or just being in an unfair competitive situation on a playing field with someone born biologically male. And we are not allowed to talk about that in the Democratic Party. It's forbidden. This is not up for debate. You can't even raise the issue. This is the same attitude that a lot of Democrats had when problems cropped up at the southern border, and we said, nope, nothing going on there, nothing to see there. It's the same issue we had when inflation started under President Biden, and the White House said, oh, it's transitory, don't worry, it'll just go away. We have this habit of preaching down to people in America rather than listening to them and responding to their concerns. And I think that's part of why we lost this election.
Where did that come from? And who's the enforcement person? What's the Bureau of Enforcement within the Democratic Party that suppresses what you and op-eds have described as a kind of hostility to free speech?
Yeah. No, it really is. It's amazing.
Is that informal? How does it happen?
It's a great question. I mean, this party that has worked so hard to be tolerant because we want to accept different people and different perspectives, and we stand up for minority rights, but we've worked so hard to be tolerant of all these distinct minority groups that as a whole we've become intolerant if you disagree with the perspective of any of those distinct groups. So it's actually the activists, the interest groups that set out these surveys, for example. This is what got Kamala Harris in trouble with that anti-trans ad that Trump ran so much. It was the most effective ad of the Republican campaign, and it all came back to her filling out an ACLU survey that said she would support transgender surgeries for federal prison inmates. And because she put it on the record...
And then she was asked about it on camera.
That's right. So these interest groups drive their agenda into our conversation, and it's litmus tests. It's like yes or no. You either support it or you don't. And if you don't check that box for, in this case, the ACLU, then you don't get their endorsement or whatever. And that's a real problem for our party.
And does that activist litmus testing flow through House leadership ranks? Does it flow through Senate leadership ranks? Does it flow through the nominating process? I mean,
well, I'll tell you,
is it an enforcement mechanism that you as a single member of Congress feel around you and are intimidated by?
So you feel it all around you, but it's not necessarily from leadership. In fact, Hakeem Jeffries, who's my leader in the House, has been very supportive. He said, look, Seth, we need to have these conversations. You're absolutely right. And he even pointed out that a lot of times these activist groups don't even support their own constituents. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many LGBTQ people, activists themselves, individuals have reached out completely supportive of what I said, saying, yes, we need to have these conversations.
Okay.
And I even agree on the transgender issue, for example. But if we don't have that conversation, then we cede the ground to Republicans. They set the agenda. So imagine, right, we're going to probably in this new Republican-controlled Congress under Trump vote on some anti-trans bills. I have no doubt. And if we can't come back with a compromise, because that's going to be hard. A lot of groups say no compromise allowed. But if we can't come back with a compromise that would say protect the civil rights of transgender people, which even some moderate Republicans would agree with, then Republicans are going to just take this and run with it. They're going to win elections on it, and they are going to get their extremist agenda signed into law.
So let's have this conversation right here and right now. You have supported the Transgender Bill of Rights. You voted against a Republican-drafted Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act.
Yeah, it was too extreme.
You supported the Equality Act, which recognize transgender rights
Yep.
and protect some application of athleticism for those whose new or defined sexual identity is different than the one they were born with. So let's have this conversation. What do you want? What do you want the party to do? What do you want the party to say that it isn't doing or saying?
Yeah, so first of all, just to add to your list too, I've actually been the leader in the Congress on getting rights and benefits restored to veterans discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I've been a crusader on LGBTQ rights. I mean, my record with the Human Rights Commission, is perfect. But I think in this case, there are a lot of people, including members of the LGBTQ community, who feel like in certain sports, not necessarily all sports, but in certain sports, like swimming, for example, there probably should be restrictions on transgender women. These are people who were born biologically male but have transitioned and now in some cases want to compete in women's sports. And we've seen the videos. There was an incident that happened just in a town right next to my hometown that was a girls got hurt. This is a problem. And by the way, the Olympics has these restrictions, right? The NCAA has certain restrictions. So I don't think Democrats are going to cancel the Olympics over this, right? And yet that's what many Democrats are trying to do, just literally cancel this debate. Say this is not up for debate. You can't debate this issue. And I actually think I've heard from a number of trans people, and again, I'm not speaking for all. I'm just sharing what I've heard from some who've come to me and said, yeah, this is pretty reasonable. And by the way, it would not be a bad idea to propose some legislation that has some compromises on this sports issue that the vast majority of Americans agree with, but also in exchange codifies into law basic civil rights. Like you cannot fire someone for being trans. You can't fire someone for what clothes they wear to work. You can't prevent trans people from getting access to medical care, which, by the way, I think we should expect that to happen under Trump and RFK Jr.
You mentioned the Olympics.
Yeah.
You can see, and we all saw during the Summer Olympics in Paris how this could get inflamed even when the person around which these flames are building is a woman and has been a woman all her life. I'm talking about Imane Khalif, an Algerian boxer who hit an Italian woman boxer. She withdrew, said she was hit too hard. Immediately, it was said that this woman, who'd been a woman her entire life, was a man, and competing as a man inflamed this entire issue unfairly to the boxer in question.
Right.
And completely blurring all of these lines about what is or isn't at the center of this debate.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, look, I am not an expert on these issues.
Neither
Obviously,
am I.
I haven't been, learned a bit more about them in the last couple of weeks.
But I mean, the trans
But I think
community is fearful about that kind of stuff.
And so I've heard this concern. It's a very legitimate concern. But I think it's all the more reason to just establish some rules that we can all agree with and then move on. And a big part of this is being able to settle this debate and move on so that Democrats can focus on the issues that really matter to American voters, like the economy, like taking down inflation, like immigration. Even in Massachusetts, we're feeling the problems of the southern border because there are a lot of illegal migrants coming to Massachusetts. We have to deal with those issues. But as long as Republicans are able to paint us as just focused on these things, because we can't resolve the debate or we've refused to even engage it. Remember that when Trump put something like $200 million behind these anti-trans ads, for weeks, Harris didn't even respond. She didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And that's what I'm talking about. We're not even able to talk about this stuff. Therefore, we can't resolve it, move on, and focus on the issues that Americans care about.
As everyone in this audience knows, we talk about everything here, just about everything. Seth Moulton's our special guest. Indigo is our host restaurant. Back for segment 2 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
Fundamentally, what it's saying to people is, oh, you think grocery prices are up? No, you're just wrong.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Welcome back to Indigo, our host restaurant near Capitol Hill. The appetizers have arrived. Congressman Moulton will be filling his face with all of them in due course, I promise you. I'll probably try to elbow my way in there. Yeah,
This is a real good spot.
picked by the congressman. So, it's on the street corner, ladies and gentlemen. We hear some of the D.C. traffic. You just heard an ambulance go by. That's real. Everything is real on the Takeout. Let's talk about some of the core rubber meets the road politics of
Sure.
what we were just discussing. There's now conversations about you getting primaried in your district in Massachusetts. Somebody from Tufts, the head of the political science department, either texted or sent an email or called or something
Called
and
the
said,
office, yeah.
called the office and said, there'll be no internships from Tufts because of your stance on transgender issues.
Because of one issue, because of one statement, really. And I wasn't even definitively saying, like, this should be the policy. I was just saying we should be able to talk about this stuff. And when actually the head of the political science department said, nope, we're not going to support anyone who wants to work in your office. My question is, what if a Tufts student, God forbid, actually wanted to work in a Republican office? And notwithstanding my long-standing record on rights for LGBTQ people, including fighting tooth and nail in defense bill debates to protect trans rights in the military. So this is a problem with our party, right? And I can't tell you how many people from all across the party, very high levels in the Obama, Biden and Harris teams have reached out. Very progressive colleagues. I just talked to one on the floor, one of the most, I won't use her name, but one of the most progressive members of Congress who just said, what happened to you is ridiculous, and it's a big problem with our party, because we're telling everybody that if you don't check every single box as defined by these litmus test issues on the far left, then you're not welcome in our party. You can't be a majority party. You can't win elections if that's your approach.
Not only that, it affirms what Republicans say about you.
Right, that we're preachy, we talk down to people. I mean, think about conversations that you've overheard or seen happen in your family even, when someone comes up to a Democrat and says, I'm voting for Trump. Basically, we say, not only are you wrong, but you're immoral, you're a bad person. And that kind of preaching doesn't win elections. We've done amazing things as Democrats, like healthcare, passing Social Security and Medicare when only the rich had insurance, making sure that people with pre-existing conditions were able to get coverage under Obamacare against fierce Republican opposition, passing gay marriage into law. Right?
Labor rights, civil rights.
Labor rights, civil rights, all these things we were able to achieve by listening to people in America who had great ideas, who wanted more rights, lifting up their concerns, having debates about them. Remember, we nominated Barack Obama most recently in 2012, and he was opposed to gay marriage.
Right.
We allowed that dissension in our party. I disagreed with him on that. But I still supported him as our nominee. I didn't try to cancel Barack Obama, right? People didn't say we should primary the president because he disagrees with us on this issue. And that's
You allowed,
how we were able to,
you allowed an evolution.
that's right. And we were able to build a big coalition as a result. And when you have a big coalition, then you can have these debates, then you can raise these issues, and then you can set the agenda rather than having it be set by the Republicans.
When I have post-2024 conversations with Democrats, my first question to get a baseline is always this. In your opinion, Seth Moulton, was this race ever winnable
Yes.
for Kamala Harris?
Yes, it was.
Why was it, and when was it lost,
Yes,
and how was it lost?
Look, I mean, there's no question that she had a huge handicap getting in so late, right? And I was the third person in the Congress to call for President Biden to step down. A difficult decision for me, a decision I only made after making a lot of behind-the-scenes calls for him to step down. He was a mentor to me when I first came to Congress as the vice president. I think the world of Joe Biden. But let's be honest, he should have stepped aside earlier. It was also hard for Kamala Harris because a lot of people disagree with the president's record. But what she needed to do, in my humble opinion, and she's a way more successful politician than I am, right? I mean, vice president of the United States. But what I think she needed to do is immediately separate herself from the president on key issues. I would have started with immigration. I would have said, look, I love Joe Biden. I was a loyal vice president. He did great things for America. But the immigration policy didn't work. And I disagree with it. Here's what I would do differently. Because fundamentally, we switched her in for him because he was losing.
Right.
So you can't just attach yourself to the losing record.
And you can't go on The View and say, I can't think of a thing I would do differently.
I mean, literally the worst thing she could have possibly said in a campaign that was clearly trying to get rid of an incumbent. Now, look, we actually had this amazing situation where 2/3 of Americans didn't want either Trump or Biden. So Democrats should have gotten credit for rising to the occasion and actually giving the American public a new candidate. But then that candidate, unfortunately, she just attached herself to the president, and they were essentially one and the same.
Related to the question I just asked you, was there ever a point in this campaign when you thought to yourself, she's going to win?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't surprised at the end. I was down in
Like
Pennsylvania.
coming out of the convention or something, you think, whoa, she's going to win. Did you
so-
ever think
so-
that?
Yeah, I mean, so towards the end, I went into the election thinking Trump was probably going to win. But earlier, maybe a month in, especially right after the debate, remember how good she was in the debate. I mean, she crushed Trump in the debate, and her numbers were
She knew
soaring.
that's why there wasn't another debate.
That's right. Of course, he didn't want. He's scared. I mean, he's
But
a wimp.
also
He's
shrewd.
scared. Well, fine. But the bottom line is he was scared. He was scared of her and didn't want to do another debate. But her numbers were surging. They were up and they were going up. At that moment, I thought she could win.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned inflation. Did that issue fall into the category of tone deafness and
It did.
Democrats saying to each other, either we shouldn't talk about it or we can't talk about it, or gosh darn it, how are we going to talk about it?
The initial response from the administration when inflation started going up was, don't worry about it, people. It's just transitory. I mean, I'm not even sure I know what transitory means, okay? Like, first
Your
of all,
constituents clearly didn't.
right. What does that even mean? But fundamentally, what it's saying to people is, oh, you think grocery prices are up? No, you're just wrong. Let me tell you what's really happening in your life. Let me tell you how to feel about your grocery bill, because we know better up here in the White House or down here in Washington, right? That, again, is this sort of arrogant attitude that a lot of people detect from Democrats. And it's reflected in the fact that even though Harris had way better policies on inflation, because Trump's deportations, tax cuts for billionaires, and tariffs will all raise inflation. Every economist in America came out and said Trump's going to raise prices, Kamala's going to lower prices. Nonetheless, the American people trusted Trump more on the economy. So clearly this was not about policy. People weren't doing the policy analysis and saying who has a better inflation reduction policy. They just got this sense that Democrats don't get us. There is this cultural disconnect, and I think it comes from this arrogance we have in the party.
And would you say that there was a reflexive desire among enough voters, not the whole country, but enough voters to decide this election to punish Democrats for that perceived arrogance?
I mean, look, we can dive into the polling more to find the exact answer, but that seems like it. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people. I heard from a lot of people, like Marines I served with, for example, they didn't want to support a draft dodger for president of the United States, someone who several senior Marines had said is unfit for command as commander-in-chief. They didn't fundamentally want to support Donald Trump, but they said, Seth, the Democrats are just so out of touch. I can't bring myself to vote for Kamala Harris. Now, you can say, okay, that was unfair. You know, in some cases, some people have accused Americans of just being racist or sexist. I mean, sure, that was a factor, right, in some cases. But for a lot of people, they said, no, like, I really wanted to get rid of Donald Trump, but I just feel like you Democrats don't get us.
What Democrats do or don't get, that's going to be an ongoing part of this conversation, plus some things that are in the headlines. Syria, Afghanistan. Seth Moulton knows a thing or two about both and other things. Our conversation will continue from Indigo. Happy to be here. In just one moment. Takeout, segment 3.
I pressed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, back in April, months before the withdrawal. I said, why have you not started this process already?
Welcome back to Takeout. Welcome back to Indigo. We're beginning to dive into the appetizers. Seth Moulton is our special guest. House member, Democrat, Massachusetts. He mentioned Marines.
Good.
Marine, you're always a Marine. You're never a former Marine. 4 tours in Iraq.
As an infantry officer, yeah.
Yes, infantry officer. And among the first to arrive in Baghdad.
Among the first Marines.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
I want to talk to you briefly about the events in Syria. What are the U.S. interests? And when President-elect Trump says it's not our fight, suggesting we're not going to be involved, kids, we're going to be involved.
It's a little naive. A former ambassador from a prominent Middle Eastern country told me a few weeks ago, he said, Seth, you may try to forget about the Middle East, but the Middle East will not forget about you. we're going to keep getting drawn back in. And that's why it's important to have a forward-looking, thoughtful, proactive policy. And by the way, one of the clear goals of that policy should be to not get too involved, right? Maintain enough presence to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have to send a lot of troops back in, as we did when President Obama quickly pulled us out of Iraq. He quickly pulled us out. ISIS took over. All of a sudden, under his watch, we had to put tens of thousands of troops back into Iraq. That's fundamentally the situation that we want to avoid. So we're going to have to be involved in the Middle East, but we've got to do so thoughtfully. We've got to have a strategy. We really haven't had a strategy for Syria. So this new chaos also presents an opportunity. And we need an opportunity to provide some strategy that ultimately stabilizes the region so we don't have to be there permanently, and of course provides freedom and democracy for the Syrian people.
Do you know Mike Waltz well?
I do. I've worked with him a lot on the Armed Services Committee. I think he's by far the best pick in Trump's
incoming national security advisor.
Incoming national security advisor. Now, I understand the bar's fairly low. Yes, he's better than RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth,
Kash Patel.
Kash Patel. The
Tulsi
list
Gabbard.
goes on. So Mike Wallace is great. He's actually, like I say, I think he's the best pick so far. I last talked to him about 10 minutes ago on the House floor, and I looked at him and I said, you got to be strong. You got to be strong. You've got to stand up to the worst impulses of the Trump team, because I've heard from good Americans, including some Marines, prominent Marines who were in his administration, not because they fundamentally supported him, but because they wanted to keep the ship of state on track. And there were a lot of times when they had to intervene with President Trump and say, no, sir, you're not going to do this. We need strong people to keep him in line before he gets us into a war or does something else stupid on a whim.
Back to Syria ever so briefly. Do you believe that the collapse of the Assad regime, 53 years and counting up until just 2 weeks ago, is reflective of a collapse of authority and projection of power in that region for Iran and Russia?
It is. Iran's a big loser here. They've lost their axis of resistance. We got to be careful about how they try to rebuild that. They may decide that they're going to restore credibility, not with this arc of terrorist groups, but
by
with
rushing
weapons.
to a nuclear weapon.
Right.
And the means to deploy it.
That's right. Now, Russia's a big loser, too. I mean, they've lost their access effectively to the Mediterranean Sea. We'll see how it plays out exactly.
Air base and a warm water port there.
This is in many ways a
Tartus.
huge gift to the United States of America, and we risk squandering it if Trump just takes this isolationist 1930s stance that says we're not going to have anything to do with it, we're not going to be involved. Let's remember that Secretary Mattis, one of the best members of President Trump's cabinet in his first term, for all the different things that went wrong, he ultimately resigned when Trump said pull the troops out of Syria. I was in Iraq about 2 months ago, and I came back from there saying, we can't let this place fall apart. It's going to be far more trouble if we do. And the best thing we can do to prevent that is not pull all our troops out. And yet I expect Trump to do that. We had a hearing on the Hill today about the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan, which many people rightly criticize the Biden administration for. But let's not forget, Trump wanted to pull us out even sooner. And don't think he would have saved a single Afghan translator, an issue that's really close and personal to veterans of both parties all across America.
Let's talk about Afghanistan. How badly was that botched? And do you agree with many who look at the polling data and see that when that happened, independents who had been with the Biden administration all through that first year got off the bus and never got back on?
Actually, the polling is very clear. His numbers never recovered. That was the one point where Biden's numbers went off a cliff. I think the more interesting question is why. I think it was the sense that Biden was elected in part because he promised competence, right? And then this was where the administration was pretty incompetent. And there were members of Congress like myself.
And in an East Room press conference, based on a question from a Wall Street Journal reporter who I give tremendous credit to, Biden declared this will not be like Saigon. How dare you even ask us? It's not going to be a chaotic withdrawal.
It was terribly chaotic, and 13 Americans lost their lives. Hundreds of Afghans, innocent Afghans, lost their lives. They're still being killed because we didn't get everyone out who worked for us, and so they're being hunted down by the Taliban as we speak. And it sent a message across the world that America's not serious about our commitments. And this wasn't that hard. All the military advisors said don't completely withdraw, leave a few thousand troops in there.
And certainly hold Bagram.
And just hold on to it, right? But even if you did, you should have started it earlier. And those of us who'd served in Congress, myself on the Armed Services Committee, I pressed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, back in April, months before the withdrawal. I said, why have you not started this process already? They basically had no answer, and the disaster in August is what resulted.
And you and other members of Congress, those who were sensitized to the immigration issues for special immigrant visas, meaning the translators, all that summer, were sending hot messages to the White House, to the State Department. This is a huge crisis. It's building underneath your feet. What are you doing? And what I kept hearing was, don't worry about it. We got it under control.
That's what we heard too. And they weren't
didn't.
They weren't telling us the facts. That's why Peter Meyer and I, an Afghan veteran, the two of the only people in Congress who'd actually spent time like out in the cities in Afghanistan at different parts of our career, we went to withdrawal to try to understand what was going on. We came back with some important answers. For example, a lot of members of Congress wanted to delay the withdrawal further. That was our impression going in. For complicated reasons, we understood once we got on the ground that was not the right decision at the time. And so they were not only telling us everything was fine, they weren't giving us the facts. They weren't answering basic questions. And sadly, this is an unfortunate legacy of the administration. Like, again, we can expect more of this from Trump. He wanted to pull out of Afghanistan sooner. He pulled out of Syria when all the military advisors said he shouldn't. This could get worse, but let's be honest, it was pretty bad.
And you have said that the pundits got the war in Afghanistan wrong for going on 20 years. So there was a lot of things being told to the American public about trajectories in Afghanistan that just didn't bear out.
For a long time. There are a lot of lies about Afghanistan.
What's that
but
about?
A lot of lies about Afghanistan
That's bipartisan.
are still not an excuse for screwing it up at the end. But yes, bipartisan, absolutely.
What's that about?
But let me just say, well, look, I don't think we have an hour to go through it all, right? Lots of mistakes made along the way. In part, by the way, not enough adequate oversight from Congress. That's what Peter and I were doing when we went there. Is fundamentally our constitutional responsibility, fulfilling that responsibility to provide oversight for the administration. But let's also remember that in the midst of this chaos, a group of veterans came together from across the country and actually across the world, because there were Australian vets, British vets, many of our coalition partners who had translators there as well. And we all got together. Didn't matter what party you were from, didn't matter what service you were in, and we worked together to save a lot of lives, to save a lot of allies who would put their lives on the line, not just for Afghanistan, but for America. And that's an important success story that I don't want to be forgotten.
Seth Moulton is our special guest. Indigo is our host restaurant. Again, the appetizers, we'll get into them even more. Segment 4, the Takeout, in 1 second.
Look at where our party leadership is, from New York City, San Francisco. I mean, like, that's not middle America, folks, right?
Welcome back to Takeout. Great to have you with us. Seth Moulton is our guest. So we spent the first two segments diagnosing the problem. You want to spend a little bit of time pointing to the future.
Absolutely.
What does it look like? How do you change it? What needs to happen? What are indicators that it is changing?
Look, I think the future for Democrats can be bright. And we will continue being the party that brings more freedom to Americans, that delivers civil rights, that delivers improvements in healthcare, and all the things that we have a proud legacy of doing for this country. But we've got to start by looking ourselves in the mirror and admitting that we need to change. We can't just make excuses for this election. We got to diagnose the problem and make some changes. So what are those changes? Well, first of all, we got to stop this too much preaching, not enough listening. And we've got to do that in a very public way. So I want to see leaders of our party and people like me just go out and genuinely hold town halls. Don't do it by Zoom, do it in person, and listen to Americans and their concerns. And show that we're willing to take their ideas, not just shove our ideas down their throat. one person who can set a great precedent for this is a new leader of the DNC. So another thing we have to do is elect a change agent to head the DNC. Not someone who's going to be in the background, but someone who's going to be a bit of a bull at China shop and say we need to make some changes. There are some things that actually went well in this election. I have a group called Serve America I started that helps veterans get elected in tough seats. We're really responsible for flipping a lot of seats. In fact, in 2018, the last time Democrats had to take back the House, this is amazing. More than half the seats we flipped in the entire country as Democrats were my Serve America candidates. That's a success story. In the 2024 election that we just had, when we all know Democrats didn't do that well, our win rate was 89%. So this is a model that works. We need leaders in the party who are going to empower the success stories. Like, let's invest more in models like Serve America. And let's get away from the litmus test interest group surveys and whatnot that are holding us back. We also need to look at the leaders. The most senior Democrats in the House, they all come from safe districts. So you don't have prominent voices in the party who know how to win tough seats, right? I mean, look at we'll look at where our party leadership is, from New York City, San Francisco. I mean, like, that's not middle America, folks, right? And I get it. Like, by the way, look at me. I'm from Massachusetts.
Right.
I got into this because of my time in the Marines, but I also have this little handicap that I got a bunch of degrees from Harvard. So I'm someone who knows, I can't just listen to my Harvard friends. We're not going to figure out how to fix this party by holding a conference at Harvard on what the working people of America need, right? That sounds like what Democrats like to do. That's not how to solve this.
Does the Democratic Party have a masculinity problem?
What does that mean?
Meaning men, as they showed up in the election, Latino men, African-American men, thought Trump was stronger, and strength to them equaled something that was more bankable than the alternative.
Well, I mean, we definitely...
And through podcasts and through this other outreach, it was one of the threads that people were wondering about before the election. Do the election results tell you something definitive about that?
Well, one of the problems is we just didn't engage with this population. So people told Harris, you don't go on Joe Rogan. Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan once, and he was
Joe Rogan was
assailed.
once a Bernie Sanders sort of acolyte.
And you know why he was? Because Bernie went on his program, had a reasonable conversation, and Joe said, okay, I like what I'm hearing. But Harris wouldn't even do that. And a lot of Democrats won't do that because after Bernie had that conversation, he was assailed by the left for saying you're empowering a hater of this, that, or the other group or whatever. And that might be true. Like, I certainly don't agree with Joe Rogan on everything. But that's why you go on these shows, to engage with these people and actually try to change their minds.
Mm-hmm. And one of the underlying assumptions, and I'm sure this cropped up in the conversation you tried to have about the southern border, about inflation, well, don't take the bait that's on Fox News.
That's right. They say, Republicans are weaponizing this issue. In fact, I was, a couple years ago, there was someone running for the Democratic messaging position in the House, and I asked her, what do you think we should do about the border? How should we talk about immigration? And her answer to me was, oh, no. We should not talk about immigration. Wait. This is a really big issue. Why should we not talk about it? Well, it's just because it's playing into Republican hands. They're weaponizing the issue. Again, when we refuse to engage in these issues because we just buy into this Republican attack, then these issues get settled on their terms. And you know who the losers are? Exactly the kind of people, whether they be immigrant people, immigrants, trans people, whoever, the people that Democrats need to stand up for and protect.
What is the state of resistance?
Well, I don't think
post-election.
Look, this is a big issue, right? Because a lot of people are saying, okay, we got to win the midterms. My personal view is we're not going to win the midterms unless we make some of these changes. But we're also not going to be an effective opposition if we don't make some of these changes. Because look, when Republicans control the Senate and the House, and obviously the White House, then the only way you can stop the Trump agenda is by putting forward more reasonable pieces of legislation, not as extreme as the Trump team's bills, and getting a few moderate Republicans on your side to support them so that your bill wins out over their extreme agenda.
And with the House Republican majority 2020 and a Democratic minority of 215, there's lots of room there.
Absolutely, we can do that. But again, we can't do it if we refuse to even put out a compromise, because some people in our party say, nope, there's no discussing that. There's no compromise on this issue or that issue. So this is the hard work that you have to do in opposition. But if we do it well, if we show Republicans that we're not going to just reflexively oppose everything they do, we're going to be targeted, we're going to pick our battles, we're going to crush them with better bills on the things that really matter, and we're even going to work with them when they occasionally have a good idea. That's the way to show Americans that they want to have Democrats back in power.
Is it fair to distill your message to fellow progressives? Let's stop worrying about purity and let's start thinking about tactics?
That's part of it. That's part of it. It's also just, let's think about how we can be a majority party. Let's think about what different views we have to accept in a wider tent, where you might not agree with us on everything, but you agree with us on enough that we can welcome you into the party, and therefore we have a big enough coalition to win.
What does that look like, let's say, for example, on something regarding immigration in the very early days of the Trump administration?
Well, I think that we should agree that we need more border enforcement. And there are a lot of Democrats who say never give an inch on border enforcement because we just care about making sure that immigrants who come here have a pathway to citizenship. The reality, and I think most Americans know this, is we need to do both. Because a majority of Americans, in fact, amazing statistic, even a majority of Republicans support giving dreamers citizenship. These are kids who were brought here through no fault of their own, but brought here illegally. They've grown up as Americans. Their country is America. They don't even often speak the language from where their parents came from, right? They need to stay here. And the majority of Americans know that and believe in it. Conservative Republicans don't want to let that happen. But reasonable Republicans, reasonable Democrats want to let that happen. Same thing with border security. Reasonable Democrats, reasonable Republicans want to increase border security. So let's shed the extremes for a minute here and get some compromise solutions that the majority of Americans can get behind. And let's not also forget, let's not let people forget that Trump was the one who played politics with immigration and sunk the bipartisan border deal that Republicans and Democrats had negotiated together. So he's the one playing politics with immigration. But that argument only works if we have a reasonable proposal that the majority of Americans can get behind to contrast with his extreme agenda.
The voice of Seth Moulton. Our thanks again to Indigo, our host restaurant. Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial. That is next. We'll see you next week, folks.
I think this is a huge opportunity for the Democratic Party to rebuild, to recognize that we've got to make some changes, but we can make some changes and present a real contrast.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Seth Moulton, Democrat, House, Massachusetts, from Massachusetts, our special guest. So, last two questions. The thing you are most cautiously optimistic about in the incoming Trump administration, the thing you are most dramatically afraid of in the incoming Trump administration?
It's hard to narrow it down. I mean, I'm not very optimistic about just about anything. I feel
Okay.
a lot of people are trying to sort of normalize things, maybe make everyone feel better or make themselves feel better by just saying, hey, maybe this time won't be as bad. There's no evidence to support that. He's not bringing in responsible people, with a very few exceptions like Mike Waltz, into his administration. He's bringing in lackeys who are just going to pursue his extremist agenda and not stand up to him. So I think the next 2 years, especially if we can get to the point where we win back the House, are going to be pretty brutal. But I'll tell you what I'm optimistic about. I think this is a huge opportunity for the Democratic Party to rebuild, to recognize that we've got to make some changes, but we can make some changes and present a real contrast to these extreme Republicans, to show that we're the party that can bring Americans together. We're the party that can welcome in those who are disaffected or turned off by the Trump agenda. We have a huge future as Democrats, but we got to make it happen.
Do you have any interest at all, politically or tactically, in the Department of Government Efficiency? Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk.
Look, I think they're probably going to do a lot of bad stuff, but if there are ways that they can make government more efficient, sure. I mean, I think every American can think of some example where the government ain't that efficient, right? So yes, there are opportunities there, but they're also just going to try to cut a tremendous amount of services and people that are really important to our government. And a side story there is they're going to try to politicize the civil service. They're going to try to put political lackeys into the civil service, a reform that was finally made to fix the cronyism in American politics back over 100 years ago at the end of the 19th century. they're really going to take us backwards in a lot of ways. That's why we need Democrats to start winning again.
The progressive era, ladies and gentlemen, was built around ending patronage in the federal government, among other things. Seth Moulton, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next week, folks.